It is time for a very special edition of Dying to Bloom with your host, Carrie Potter, and special guest right here on WRCR AM 1700 and WRCR.com.
Welcome to Dying to Bloom. This is the October special edition with guest star Linda Zimmermann. By the way, I am Carrie Potter. I'd like to start off with something a little scary myself, and that's the current cost of funerals. Through this show, I try to encourage you to consider the environmental impact and cost of funeral and burial choices. Our friends at the National Funeral Consumers Alliance and Consumer Federation of America released a report this month based on a national survey of the prices and price disclosures of a sample of 150 funeral homes from 10 different regions of the country. The survey revealed significant price differences, for example, from $2,580 to $13,800 for a full-service funeral, and the failure of most funeral homes to disclose their prices adequately. Only 38 of the 150 homes fully disclosed prices on their websites, while 24 failed to fully disclose prices both on their website and in response to an email and a phone call. Now, the Federal Trade Commission's funeral rule was issued in 1984 and amended in 1994, and it requires funeral homes to provide only price information over the phone or a price list for those visiting the home. It's good for you to know that, number one, but it does not require disclosure on the websites of funeral homes. Think about how beneficial this would be to the consumer. It's uncomfortable visiting a funeral home. You may feel the pressure or guilt when making a purchase decision and may even be led to believe that an airtight coffin will preserve the body, which is not true, by the way. We may cover exploding caskets on a future show, or that embalming is a requirement, not true. You get the idea. Wouldn't it help the consumer to be able to easily price shop? Yes, it's smart to price shop for funerals. The Funeral Consumers Alliance believes that the Federal Trade Commission needs to require funeral homes to disclose prices clearly and completely on their websites. This disclosure will greatly increase the consumer search for price information. The Funerals Consumer Alliance and the Consumer Federation of America are submitting this research to the Federal Trade Commission, and they're urging the agency to update the funeral rule. You can visit funerals.org and keep listening to this show, Dying to Bloom, for more information or to keep updated on that. Previous Dying to Bloom episodes are also available on the Dying to Bloom YouTube channel. Help set the trend, back to natural burials while preserving open space. Consider donating to the Green Burial Fund through the Rockland Community Foundation at rocklandgives.org. And if you'd like to contact me regarding this or any other topics, you can email me at dyingtobloom@gmail.com. Now, I'm very excited, by the way, for our upcoming guest. And now, without further ado, let's have some fun. She is a well-known author, historian, and ghost investigator. Let's welcome to Dying to Bloom, Linda Zimmermann. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for joining us here on WRCR AM 1700. I know this is a busy time of year for you.
Yes, it is. This is certainly the month for the dead and the undead.
Well, before we even get started, Linda, how can people be informed of where you're going to be and how they can catch some of your events?
They can go to my website, which is gotozim.com. That's GOTOZIM.com, and my full schedule will be listed there.
Now, Embalming, I talk about that on this show frequently. It's become part of our ritual for some time after the Civil War. But before that time, we handled our own dead. We washed and cared for them and often put them in the parlor room for visitation. And the Victorians had many interesting customs. I know it was normal to photograph deceased loved ones. And I absolutely love mourning jewelry, which often included tiny, intricate, weaved, braided hair of the deceased in their jewelry designs. What else can you tell us about ancient customs, Victorian or otherwise?
Well, in regards to the Victorians, probably talk about them all day. They had such an incredible set of rituals and superstitions, such as the moment the person died, you had to stop all the clocks in the house. You had to cover all the mirrors so that the spirit of the deceased wasn't trapped in a mirror. If there were any photos of family members, you immediately put them face down so that those family members did not become possessed by the spirit of the deceased. Yes, the hair jewelry is very bizarre. Black clothing, of course, wreaths with black ribbons on them on the door. As you mentioned, they would probably have the wake in the living room, which could last 3 to 4 days, which is why flowers and candles became part of funerals, because if you had a deceased family member laying in your living room for 3 or 4 days, things could get a bit fragrant.
I guess ice was harder to come by then, because now even with the natural, people are trending back towards actually waking people in their homes, but they do utilize dry ice and refrigeration products.
Right. So you could imagine a small farm somewhere. They're not, in the middle of summer, they're not going to have access to, the refrigeration, obviously, or ice. But even the clothing that you would have to wear from anywhere from 1 to 3 years, you talk about expense. The list of mourning clothes you were required to buy was unbelievable. You would spend astronomical amounts of money outfitting yourself and your family to wear the proper clothing. A woman's Victorian outfit, it wasn't a dress and a pair of shoes. It was, how many different layers, and the veils and the gloves, and even to the point where your stationery had to be bordered in black.
Really?
Death really controlled that society at that time.
That's really interesting, and how we've progressed. We're so much more distant from those practices these days.
People are often encouraged now to get out and start meeting other people or get back into society, within a certain time after the death of a loved one, whereas in Victorian times, especially for the widow, your life was over for a year. You are in mourning. You're not supposed to have fun or enjoy yourself, and it could go on for years. Queen Victoria really set the trend with her 40 years of mourning of Prince Albert, who died in 1861. And obviously, if you're living in Victorian England, you wanted to do what the Queen was doing. And so she really set in motion this extended period of grief and mourning.
It wouldn't be feasible today to to follow through with such intricate practices.
No, it's in our fast-paced society, the thought of doing anything for a year, or let alone doing it for 3 years or whatever. I mean, today we move on. I mean, it doesn't mean you will not always grieve for your lost loved one, but life goes on, and in times past, society didn't want to see you move on anytime soon.
Now, We have not rehearsed this conversation, so I'm not sure where exactly you want to go next. But some things that come to mind while I'm listening to you now is I went on a historical home tour at one point, and I thought I remember being told that back in the day, people sat more in an upright position because laying down when you were sleeping reminded them more of a funeral or a laid-out body. Have you ever heard that?
No, that is a new one on me.
Okay. Well, we'll move on.
There are so many superstitions. It's, as I said, we could probably talk all day. And their fear of death as well. Obviously, child mortality rates were horribly high. The average life expectancy wasn't as high. So everything to them seemed to be an omen. If you heard a howling dog or a hooting owl in the night, that meant somebody was going to die. We all know the superstition of you shouldn't open an umbrella. Mm-hmm. Inside a house will be bad luck. Well, they thought if you did, that meant somebody in the house would not only die, they would be murdered. Spilling salt, of course, was a horrible omen. Just everything. They lived in this unnatural fear.
And you mentioned a little earlier the photos, which is really obviously different from how we look at things today. It was quite common to take photographs of the deceased, and a lot of times it was children, and the family would pose with the deceased member just so they had, I guess, a lasting memory.
Right. Today we're on camera probably 50 times a day. Back then, it was an expense. It was an effort to get a photo. So if you had a child who passed away and you wanted a memory of them, you would pose. You'd dress the child up. Some of the photos, there were different types. In fact, this is a big collector's market, believe it or not, in post-mortem photos. And there are different types where it would look like the deceased is just sleeping peacefully, or they would prop them up and put their arms around them and open their eyes and make it look like they were still alive. Put a little makeup on them to make them look more alive. Mm-hmm. It was a bizarre practice, and we really wouldn't even think of doing. I mean, who wants a picture of their deceased now? It's kind of abhorrent to think of, but back then that was their way of memorializing and preserving their memory.
Right. It was the norm, as well as the memorial jewelry, which also is starting to be a bit of a collector's item.
Oh, it's very pricey. They would carefully braid strands of hair from the deceased, either make little jewelry to wear, or if you've seen the full-sized pictures where they will make wreaths or actual entire scenes out of hair. That became a little cottage industry, and something every family usually had a piece of that. It went from a simple lock of hair, cutting a lock of hair, to actually braiding it and making little works of art out of them.
Wow, I've seen them, and I think that they're pretty amazing. It's really, there's male and female jewelry that uses this technique.
Yes, it's fabulous. It really became an amazing art form, but yet at the same time incredibly morbid when you realize the source.
Right. And, feel free, to elaborate, but I also, as I've done a little research on this, have come to find out that a benefit, I guess, at the time of laying someone out in the parlor room was, on occasion, they weren't really deceased.
Oh, it happened a lot more than we would care to think. Yes, the term "saved by the bell" came about because so many people were buried prematurely, were unconscious in deep comas and thought to be dead, that they devised, there were all kinds of different inventions, but somebody had made something where there was a little string going into the coffin and a bell above ground, so if you woke up in your coffin, you would ring that bell so that they would know to come and dig you up. And I don't know how gruesome you want to get, but I have several stories of people who were buried alive and what happened to them.
Well, there's your warning, listeners, if this is getting too gruesome for you. I think it's really intriguing and also really sad because I've read articles fairly recently, in other countries at least, where this still happens, rarely, but on occasion, where someone is buried alive.
It does still happen, yes. As early as a few years ago, it has happened in parts of the world. But it was happening a lot in the 1800s. There's a very famous case of a woman called Octavia Hatcher in Kentucky. In 1891, there was a strange sickness that was affecting people in town, and her son passed away, and then she looked to have passed away, so her husband buried her. But then people in town who were falling into this deep coma were recovering. So a week had passed, and the husband was just haunted with the thought that maybe his wife wasn't dead, and they dug up her coffin and found that she had scratched the surface of the lid of the coffin, and her fingernails were all broken and bloody as she was desperately trying to claw her way out because she had regained consciousness. And there are many, many of these cases to the fact where we had so many inventions to try to prevent that. And there was one woman, her brother had been buried alive, and they dug him back up too late. And she requested in her will that she had her head removed before burial just to make sure that she was dead. That's how desperate people were getting.
Wow. I have not heard that one before, Linda. Now,
Yes.
Everyone out there listening, just breathe for a moment. It is October. Halloween is coming, and these things happen. And luckily today, especially here in our country, most of our technology does prevent this type of thing from happening.
Yes, we can be very fortunate. We live in the age, we are living and dying in the age we are. I can't imagine a much more hideous way to go.
Yes, that is creepy and scary. Do you have any other ghost stories or ancient customs?
Well, I do have plenty of ghost stories, but there's one custom, you were talking about green funerals, and the ancients in Europe, the American Indians, the Tibetans, they had a practice called excarnation, where they would actually just either lay the body out on the ground somewhere or build a platform and let the animals and birds take care of the body. And in that way, they thought the spirit of the deceased would be released free of any, binding of the body, and also, something generous, giving the animals some sustenance. So
yes.
I don't think that would go over much today. But you can
it makes
see
sense to me. But
you can see the mindset. The Tibetans, in particular, they thought to be generous to all living creatures. So why waste a good 150 pounds of flesh when you can feed the animals?
Right. It's all a cultural thing, really, because,
it is.
Again, to me, that makes sense, but I might hesitate on that because of our culture, and I wouldn't want my children to think that's what's happening to Mom.
No, but again, when you see the different mindsets, and cremation as well is an ancient practice, and, a lot of it, again, was to release the spirit of the deceased, and it's a very efficient way of taking care of a common problem.
Now, as far as cremation goes, that also is a good way to make the point of it's all in the mindset, really, because before cremation was really an American practice, there was a period where it was considered a desecration to the body, and there was a movement against it as well. It took a while before it became an accepted practice here.
Yes, so these traditions do change, and as you said, different cultures come in with their own ideas, and some of the things we do today probably to the body would be horrifying to them, embalming and things like that. Mm-hmm. So it's all a matter of your perspective.
Yes, I do. For those that may question the necessity of embalming and what the practice is, if you can handle it, which I do encourage being educated on these choices, because it is an industry and it does cost a lot of money to almost no matter what type of burial choice you choose. It is a consumer decision, and I do encourage people to become educated on what the process is and what's involved with it, and really think over their choices.
And the expense, of course.
Yes, yes.
As well. During the Civil War, you had mentioned, it was essential because people wanted the bodies of their sons and brothers brought home. So it was needed to preserve the body to be able to ship it to wherever in the country, their homes were. But again, that's, we all have to think about our end-of-life decisions and, get family members involved in what's right and what makes sense to individuals.
Myself and all those listening would love to hear some more ghost stories.
Well, if you're familiar with Oak Hill Cemetery in Nyack, across from Nyack Hospital, that has one of my favorite cemetery ghost stories. The caretaker was walking his dogs one bright, sunny spring afternoon, not what you'd consider to be a really haunting environment, other than that it was a cemetery, and he saw a young woman in her 20s walking across the road that goes through the cemetery, but rather than exit, she walked straight for him. And he thought that was a little strange. She looked rather distant and disconnected, and he thought she was just really upset that she had just visited the grave of a loved one. And his dogs saw this woman, how dogs start wagging their tail and want attention. And as they are passing one another, no more than 6 feet away, she disappears. And he's like, I know I just saw this woman. So when I was interviewing him, I asked about the location, and he said there was nothing different. But I said, but how about where you first saw her in the cemetery? And his expression kind of changed. He said, I didn't think of that. Just 2 days before, he had attended the funeral of a young woman, same age, same physical description, and he said it was really one of the most painful and uncomfortable funerals he had ever attended. It was a young mother who died suddenly and unexpectedly.
Right.
And here he was 2 days later seeing a spirit of the same description walking through the cemetery.
Ooh.
I know. It's and he was one of the most credible witnesses. And obviously the dogs saw her too. You know how dogs react when they see someone.
Well,
so it was not his imagination.
We do have a couple of callers on the line, but I just wanted to say, if I'm going to see a ghost, I would prefer to see it during a nice, bright, sunny day then.
Yes, and have it look real and solid, and you don't realize till the last moment it wasn't a human being.
Yes. Good morning. You're on Dying to Bloom.
Yes. Good morning, Kerry, and good morning, Linda. I just had a question. Are there any documented haunted houses in Rockland?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. There was the case on Levada Place in Nyack where a couple put a down payment on the house. Then the homeowner told them it was haunted, so they wanted their money back, and the case actually went to the New York State Supreme Court. And they ruled 3-2 that because the homeowner was the one putting forth these stories, that as a matter of law, the house was haunted. And you can't get more documented than the state Supreme Court, stating that. So that case went around the world. It was known as the first legal haunting.
So they were able to get out of the purchase.
They were able to get out of the purchase, and that changed real estate laws across the country, because suddenly everybody was panicking. Wait a minute, can we be in the middle of the deal and somebody can cry ghost and break the deal? So there are disclosure laws now that if the homeowners or there's some history of a haunting there, they believe it is haunted, they have to disclose that to potential buyers.
Very interesting. Thank you, Mark.
All right, take care.
Good morning. You're on Dying to Bloom with Linda Zimmermann.
Hello?
Yes, you're on the air.
Yes, my name is Milton. I have a question for you. Nowadays in the United States, we spend an awful lot on pets, not only when they're alive, but we have pet cemeteries, and a lot of money is spent on them as a way of honoring them after they die. I'm wondering if this has ever been done in history, and also in any other countries that you know of that they do this, or is it just a trend in the United States where people will spend money on almost anything?
Well, the ancient Egyptians, we can go back that far, embalming cats and other animals that were sacred to them. So that's
for a religious reason, but I don't think it's done nowadays for a religious reason. It's just that people, they love them so much that they couldn't imagine just disposing of the body or something.
Well, there are pet cemetery men who had beloved horses, had graves to them even back in colonial times. If they had enough money, they raised statues to them. It was, I guess, it depended on the culture and how you felt about that dog, but there are some royal pets who were given funerals throughout history. So, but probably nothing, this is, I would say, unprecedented, the amount of money that Americans, at least, put into, as you say, separate pet cemeteries.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for calling. And yes, since he brought that up, I was thinking that would be a great topic for a future Dying to Bloom show, is addressing our pets and burial options for them as well.
Well, I have to tell you, my dogs were cremated and are sitting in little urns right next to me here because to me it's a remembrance of them, and I have their little dog tags and photos with them. So you can put me in that category because they were beloved family members, and to me I wanted to keep them with me.
Yes, I share that with you as well. And we are getting close to running out of time. So I did want, since you were talking about cemeteries, I did want to mention that I recently visited the Letchworth Cemetery, and while we talk about that cemetery, I certainly want to be respectful to the lives that are buried there, but it's just a very unique cemetery here in Rockland County.
It's very, very sad that they have numbers, not names on them.
There's a few
if that's
stones
the cemetery
there.
You're talking about?
Yes, it's from the Letchworth village. And
right.
One thing that seemed to be common among many of those buried there are that there were a lot of young people, children, young adults. And just the how they were treated in society at that time and how they were buried is sad. And I know that local elected officials and citizens have gotten together and put a monument there and tried to give them the respect they deserve. But it's just part of our county, so I thought it was worth mentioning, especially since I recently was able to visit.
Right, yeah, that is very sad, families not wanting as they perceived it, the shame of having a family member, who was at Letchworth and buried there, so they were only given a number. And, everybody in life and death deserves the same level of respect.
And maybe it was my own compassion, but I felt a certain energy there that felt kind of heartbreaking and a little sad. And maybe you want to speak about that or share one more final story. And of course, I'd love for you to give us your website again before we close the program as well.
Sure. Well, cemeteries in particular, obviously, are very active. There's one in Port Jervis, Laurel Grove, where for many years they've been seeing a woman walking through the cemetery, very active, lights, people feeling touched, but these people are not exactly resting in peace, because when the Delaware swells, bodies have been carried away from the edge of the cemetery and found as far as south as Philadelphia.
Oh my goodness.
And also, as other cemeteries have, there's a groundhog problem, and bones and parts of coffins have been found scattered around the grounds because they're tossing them out of their holes. So if resting in peace is required to keep a spirit soothed, it is not happening at Laurel Grove.
Not a good location.
No. But if people want to get in touch with me, see my schedule for everything I do, or get my books, I have a book, Ghosts of Rockland, if you're particularly interested in local ghosts. But my website is gotozim.com, GOTOZIM.com.
I do have to ask you one final question, and maybe you get asked this a lot, but since you've been all over and you are a ghost investigator, what location kind of gave you the creeps the most?
Probably Rockland State Hospital locally, and Letchworth. Those two locations. If I never go back, I won't be upset. I found them very, very chaotic and disturbing energies there. And
can people read about those experiences in your books?
Yes. Both places are written about in my books. I'm up to volume 13 of the Ghost Investigator series, and which are predominantly in this Orange and Rockland area. As I say, there's a whole collection of just Rockland stories. And I also have Hudson Valley Haunts, which is a tour book of historic haunted sites up and down the Hudson Valley that you can visit.
Linda Zimmermann, thank you so much for taking this time out of your busy schedule. And again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, a spooky pleasure.
And for now, folks, just a little reminder, you're alive. As far as your body and brain is concerned, it's use it or lose it. So live life to its fullest with no regrets, and join me, Carrie Potter, next month on Dying to Bloom.